They forced the rancher to marry the old maid, but she ended up owning his heart forever. Montana Territory, June 1878. The sun burned over the wide plains, and the dry wind carried dust across endless fields of grass. Cowboys shouted as they drove the cattle, but one name rose above every whisper: James Turner, the rancher who lived by his pride and worked by his own rules. He had built his ranch with grit, sweat, and an iron will, never bending to anyone. Yet behind the laughter of saloons and the quiet gossip of church gatherings, another name echoed: Clara Hayes. She was strong, kind, and graceful, but the cruel town called her the Old Maid, a title heavy with judgment. No man dared to look past her silence, and no heart dared to see her worth. People said her story was over before it began, but fate was already moving, preparing to tie her life to the one man who swore he would never be bound. The whispers in the town grew heavier as summer deepened, and with every passing day, James Turner felt the invisible hands of the elders tightening around him like a rope he could not cut. For the council of gray-haired men gathered in the courthouse spoke of honor, reputation, and duty, words that echoed louder than his own protests. And though James resisted with fire in his voice, he soon realized that their pressure carried the weight of his future. For the deal they struck tied his ranch to the marriage he never sought, a union with Clara Hayes, the woman unfairly branded as the Old Maid. And when she entered that quiet hall, her steps were steady, her back unbent, her eyes calm with a strength that no mockery could shake. Yet the crowd smirked, whispering behind their hands, feeding on cruel laughter while James stood at the altar like a man condemned, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, his heart raging against the chains he could not break. And still Clara did not flinch, for though she heard their words, she carried herself with a dignity that silenced even the boldest tongue. And in that silence James caught a glimpse of something that unsettled him more than the marriage itself, a quiet courage he could not name, a flame that lived in her eyes though no one in the town cared to see it. And as the vows were forced upon his lips, every word tasted like dust, but the moment her voice followed, steady and unwavering, the air shifted as if the wind itself paused to listen. And though he told himself he felt nothing, deep inside a question stirred that he could not push away, a question heavier than his pride. What kind of woman stands unbroken while the world laughs in her face? And what kind of man has no choice but to face her strength? The papers were signed, the deal was done, and the crowd dispersed with sneers and chuckles. Yet as James walked beside Clara into the dusk, the mocking words still chasing them through the street, he felt the strange weight of her presence, not weak as he had imagined, but steady like the earth beneath his boots. And though his pride screamed that he had been cornered, a hidden voice inside whispered that perhaps he had not been trapped at all, but led into a fate he had never dared to choose. And in that moment of quiet between them, when her gaze met his without fear, a restless storm began to gather in his chest. For the rancher who had sworn never to be bound, now found himself bound in ways no law or counsel could explain. And the question that lingered was not whether he would ever accept her, but whether he could ever escape the pull of a heart stronger than his own. The days that followed carried the weight of silence between them, a silence James believed would break Clara. Yet instead it became the ground where she revealed a strength no one had ever imagined. For when the ranch hands grew restless and the herd scattered wild across the fields, Clara stepped forward with a command in her voice that cut through the dust-filled air sharper than any whip. And men who had laughed at her name obeyed without hesitation, stunned by the certainty in her tone, while James watched with a disbelief that bordered on awe as she mounted a restless horse bareback, its muscles thrashing under her grip. Yet with steady hands and unshaken courage she tamed the beast until it bowed to her will, leaving even the most seasoned wranglers whispering her name with respect instead of mockery. And when the traders came riding with hard bargains and greedy eyes, it was Clara who faced them across the table, her words sharp as iron, her patience thin but her wit precise, turning their schemes against them until they left with fewer coins than they had hoped, and more respect than they intended. While James stood at the doorway, his pride shifting into something heavier, for he realized she had defended not only his land, but also his honor without ever raising her voice at him. And when the sky split open one night with thunder so fierce the ground trembled, rain hammering the earth as if the heavens sought to wash the plains away, it was Clara who rushed into the storm, lantern in hand, skirts clinging to her legs, calling the cattle with a strength that carried through the wind, driving them back from the swollen river where many would have drowned, her figure glowing in the lightning as she fought beside the men until dawn bled across the horizon, leaving the herd safe and the ranch unbroken. And in that fragile light, James felt something move within him, something he had long buried beneath his stubborn pride. For as he looked at her drenched and breathless yet unyielding, he saw not the old maid the town had mocked, but a woman carved from the same relentless spirit as the land itself. And in that moment, his heart began to soften against his will, each glance toward her stirring a warmth he could not deny, a whisper he could not silence. For though the marriage had been forced and his pride had resisted, James Turner was no longer blind to the truth standing before him. And he knew with every beat of his chest that the woman fate had bound to him was not a burden, but the very strength he had always needed, a strength that now held the power to break down the walls he had built around his soul. But the peace carved out of sweat and storm did not last, for greed has no patience and envy has no mercy. And one morning, the sound of hooves thundered across the valley as a rival rancher named Silas McGraw rode in with his hired guns, their rifles gleaming under the sun, their shouts declaring the land was his by right of strength. And the dust they raised carried the promise of blood. Yet before James could call the men to arms, Clara was already there, standing at the gates of the corral with a shotgun in her hands, her eyes fierce and steady, her voice cutting through the chaos as she ordered the ranch hands to hold the line. And though James had always thought of her as the woman fate had forced upon him, in that moment she was no longer a shadow beside him, but a flame burning with unshakable resolve, for she stepped forward without fear, firing warning shots into the air, daring Silas to come closer. And the townfolk who had gathered at a distance expecting to see her falter instead, watched in stunned silence as she stood her ground, her figure unyielding against the circle of armed men, while James rode out to meet Silas with iron in his eyes, realizing Clara had already taken command of hearts that once mocked her. And when the fight broke out with fists and gunfire echoing across the plains, Clara moved beside him with the precision of someone born to the land, reloading his weapon when his hands were full, driving back intruders with her steady aim, shouting orders that turned panic into courage. And for the first time, James did not feel alone in battle, for every strike he made was met with her strength beside him, every step forward shielded by her bravery, until the dust cleared and the rival men fled, broken and humiliated, leaving Silas cursing their names as he retreated into the horizon. And the town that had gathered to witness her failure now stood silent in awe. For the old maid they had once pitied was the woman who had defended the ranch with more heart than any man among them. And James, breathing hard with sweat and dust on his face, looked at her not as a wife forced into his life but as a partner carved by destiny, his chest heavy with the truth he could no longer deny, that without her the land would have fallen, and without her he would have lost himself. And in that moment of victory, with the echoes of gunfire fading into the hills, he knew his world had shifted forever. For Clara Hayes was no longer a name whispered in scorn but a name spoken with respect, and in his heart she had become the unshakable force that no enemy could ever claim. As the dust of battle settled and the valley returned to silence, James turned to Clara with a heaviness in his chest that no victory could ease, his voice trembling as he whispered the truth he had buried for too long, confessing that though they had forced him into this marriage, he thanked God they had, for without her his land would have crumbled, and his heart would have remained empty. And in that single moment of honesty, the walls he had built around his pride shattered like glass beneath her gaze. For Clara did not just stand as his wife but as the soul of his world, owning not only the ranch that had defined him, but the heart he had never given to anyone. And the town that once mocked her name now spoke it with reverence. The old maid no longer a figure of pity, but the most respected woman in Montana, her story living proof that love can bloom even in the harshest deserts of fate. And as the sun sank behind the western hills, James and Clara stood side by side, bound not by force but by a love so fierce it would echo across the plains long after their footsteps had faded.